Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here on a Sunday on a very early morning. And I hope there aren't that many sore heads after the social yesterday. My name is Tania Allard. I've already been introduced. I wear many hats in the world of open source. Uh, I'm a keyboard, sci-fi, and design nerd. So you're in for a bit of a visual treat as well, I hope. And today we're here to talk about key challenges in the PyData ecosystem and more importantly, how we can all make a change for the better or help our ecosystem thrive, not for today or tomorrow, but hopefully for the next 10, 20, 40, 60 years to come. And as someone, as I said, I wear way too many hats in the open source world, in the PyData ecosystem, and also as a director of a company, which is Quantum Labs, our core mission is building and sustaining, building inclusive and sustainable open source communities. So this topic around sustainability and challenges and how we can make our ecosystem thrive is very, very near and very dear and near to my heart. And unlike many other talks that I've given, and probably that you've seen, where we have very set sections, and like we're going to start with this, follow with this, and that, I'm still going to cover three main topics. The first one being how to build a shared vocabulary, because something that I've noticed, and especially when we work in environments that are so diverse, words matter. Words have a meaning, but also, depending on who you're talking about, the meaning that a certain word has might not be exactly the same meaning that you have for that word. And then the meaty bit will be what sometimes we call the wrench. Where is the PyData ecosystem now? What is the technical and socio-technical challenges that we're facing? And then how we can prepare for the road ahead. As I said, we're not going to go in a linear fashion, but these are very interconnected sections. These topics are going to be very interconnected, and hopefully it'll start making sense as to why I've put these slides like so. So let's start building our shared vocabulary by throwing in a very seemingly innocent question. What does open source mean to us? I'm not going to ask for a word cloud or anything. Just think about it. What does open source mean to us? And I know many of us come from a science background or like hard numbers or like things that are not unambiguous. So I can see someone asking, like, why are you asking? There is a definition, right? And that's true. We have an open source definition, which is this one. Not going to go over every point. But this is maintained by the Open Source Initiative. And through this definition, every piece of software that claims to be open source has to comply with these 10 tenets or these 10 principles. So if any piece of software doesn't comply with any of this, then by definition, it cannot be called open source. But that is not, this definition is something we can agree on. It is something that a lot of people have put together, have thought about, and have been protecting over a couple of decades now. But what I'm really interested in knowing, and I'm very interested in you reflecting about, is what does open source mean to you? This meaning, or whatever these many words or phrases you have now in your mind, will vary very vastly depending on how you came to open source. Many of you will probably have come to open source from a closed source environment first. Probably you changed jobs, and the company that you've joined favors or uses open source. For some of us, me included, open source almost 20 years ago was the most accessible way to enter into software. Because coming from a country that is not very rich, coming from a certain background, open source was definitely more accessible than paying proprietary licenses at that time. Many others will have found that open source aligns with their default values and ethics. And it turns out that it's just their default way of working. So they found their niche and their drive and something that aligns with them. And I also want to add a disclose here, because so much of what I'm going to talk about here comes from my own experience, lived experiences from many of my collaborators, folks within the PyData and the open source ecosystem. We also have to acknowledge that not all of the interactions in open source are always pleasant or enjoyable. For many people, open source, unfortunately, has also been another mechanism of oppression benefiting those already in power and having some privilege. And in many cases, open source, again, I'm not pointing towards any individuals or projects. I can guarantee that if you feel identified, I'm not talking about you. But in many cases, many folks, have not been served by the open source ecosystem as they should have. And we've accepted things as a collective that work against our purposes and is not doing any favors to any of us. And again, if I go a bit deeper or like a bit more into the particular of these conferences and the projects in which we participate here, like what does PyData mean to you? Will it be the same response? Well, you related or associated with the same words that you would associate the whole world or the whole collective of open source? Maybe. There is no single answer. I've talked to many people. My own answer of the meaning of open source and PyData has changed and evolved over time. But if we were to put all of your collective meanings and ideas and experiences together, what more than likely will happen is we'll start building a highly interconnected network of stakeholders, tools, experiences, processes. And the reason is because both open source and the PyData ecosystem are complex systems. They're all based on interactions that might not be visible, or that might not be all equal, or not all equitable. And so far, again, in the interest of building our shared vocabulary, I've used the term ecosystem a lot. So if we go and look and Google what does ecosystem mean, we're going to get something like this. And it is very important to mention and remember that in an ecosystem, we're not just talking about things like water and trees and bridges, but there are a lot of elements, some of which are living, some of which are not. But the important part is that every single element, every single part of this ecosystem plays a part in it. We are always continuously surrounded by ecosystems. That is how nature self-organizes itself. That is how society self-organizes itself. For example, Shoreditch out there is an ecosystem in itself, but it's part of the larger ecosystem of London, and in turn, part of the larger ecosystem of the United Kingdom. The PyData umbrella and the PyData ecosystem majorly intersects with the Python ecosystem. And if you think about it, the Python ecosystem is a very, very critical part of the broader open source ecosystem. So we cannot think that we're going to do or impact or change a part of an ecosystem without having a ripple effect in the other ecosystems containing it. Everything is just so intertwined and interconnected that you cannot affect change in a single part without paying attention to the others. And to me, that is one of the things that make open source so exciting. And since we are all here some sort of PyData participants, citizens, users, whatever hat you use to define yourself, let's look at how our ecosystem is doing today. It is the #1 toolset for scientific computing, data science, machine learning, and AI. There are other ecosystems, but they are not as established or as popular. We have a huge user base. I'm trusting here Ralph Gommers, who is my co-conspirator, and he said it was something between 25 to 40 million, so I'm going to believe him. It is behind some of the major scientific discoveries and projects. And it has gone from being an ecosystem mainly favored by academics and certain French communities to be part of the mainstream. It is so hard to think about any part of the industry that has not yet been touched by open source or by data, if they are in the business or area of crunching numbers, doing data science, analytics. And as any other ecosystem, it's ever growing and it's ever changing. Great. This is great. We've seen, I believe, and I want to see more open source in the world. I want to see more open source developers. I want to see open source thrive. So we're moving in the right direction there. What are the challenges that we're facing? There are many. So I've selected a few. I've consulted with some folks, with some friends, collaborators, clients. And we've agreed that some of those that are technical heavy have been around for a while, will affect end users, maintainers, and sometimes every single participant. One of which is packaging. I still have to live a full year without seeing a Twitter thread or a Reddit thread or somewhere where someone will be complaining about packaging or try to create a yet another package manager or yet another standard for packaging and metadata. It's a part of our ecosystem that is growing in complexity. But we also operate within many constraints and resources and availability, and more recently, with certain regulations in certain parts of the world, increased demand around securing supply chain. Parallelism. Historically, the NumPy-based stack of the PyData ecosystem has been single-threaded. There are occasions in which packages like scikit-learn will allow you to overcome that. You might be able to overcome the GIL, but in its majority, this is single-threaded. There is also a lot of technical debt that also has been accumulated because things change. Technology changes sometimes faster than the hands that we have to update or refactor some of the projects that we've been working on. We still have significant parts or significant chunks of Fortran 77 lying everywhere in our stack. As someone that has spent time writing Fortran 77, I truly feel for whoever will have to move from 77 to modern Fortran, because it's a huge labor, and it will not affect just one package. But if you think about making changes in the real innards of NumPy, that's going to have, again, a ripple effect in all of the packages that depend on it, which is a lot of our PyData ecosystem. Performance and scale. As we're pushing the boundaries of what we can do with hardware, as we push the boundaries on how much data we're collecting, how much data we're operating with, we're also pushing continuously to have massive scale and improved performance. And those are all technical heavy. But they're not the only type of challenges that we're facing again. Because again, remember, with an ecosystem, we're talking about living and not living elements. So again, the diversity of these elements within our ecosystem is extremely broad. I could try and capture and list all of the elements that we have, and I will probably fail. And again, as in complex systems, we have interlocking crises, each of which will have components that also affect or come from a bigger challenge. And that's why we just cannot focus on one single challenge, aim to fix it, and call it quits. Some of the biggest challenges that we have is, again, around the people that build open source, the people that consume open source, and our capacity to make our ecosystem thrive. We still have a long way to go in terms of community safety. This comes to code of conducts are great. I'm so happy that most projects have now a code of conduct, but that in itself is not enough to make our community safe and welcoming. We also have to think about human and environmental diversity. And this also means reaching people where they are, whether it is from a technical standpoint, using standpoint, or all of the spectrum of human diversity. Leadership. Again, we have to rethink what leadership means and move away from this is how we've done things for the last 10, 20 decades, 10, 20 years, or the last couple of decades. And again, a lot of the tools that we've developed in the open source ecosystem, not just in our PyData, has had the motto of developers for developers. And we need to move into paradigms that are more around user experience, access center approach, because, again, that will bring the folks that have historically not been participating in our community. Again, blast from the past. This is probably one of my favorite readings, because Tania Allard released this report in 2016 called Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor of Our Digital Infrastructure. I talk about that every time I can. But because the important part of this is that when this report went out in the world, it actually shone some light about the woeful state of our ecosystem, like how overworked, how undervalued, and how underpaid and underfunded our folks are and our digital infrastructure is. And of course, people were terrified because it's really, really hard to measure the actual cost of open source, of open infrastructure. And since then, as we expect, as we're technologists, we've seen loads of initiatives aimed at getting funding to open source maintainers. Things like this. All right? One-off donations, for those of you that are into Twitch, maybe this will bring some feelings. But we've seen a lot of well-intended, one-off financial or in-kind support from big corps, from individuals, from startups. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When we are in a crisis, we reach out to our wallet, our phone, our PayPal, for those of you that are into crypto, probably our crypto wallets or your crypto wallets, and donate some money. It feels good. I'm not going to say that it doesn't feel good. It feels good. But again, in the economic and cultural context in which we live, we've been conditioned to equate money to good and sustainable. So there is where the focus is right now. And the problem is that although all of these donations and all of this sponsoring folks through GitHub sponsors is very, very well meant and very well intended, there is a huge part of the puzzle still missing. Very few individuals or very few organizations follow through these donations to see, did it really have an impact? Did it really make the maintainers' lives better? Did it really help the project thrive? I'm not saying that if you're making a donation of £5 once a year, that entitles you to go to the maintainers and ask, what did you do with my £5? That's an entirely different boat. But again, I'm all up for paying maintainers. That is one of the big parts that we do for within Quantsite Labs. We hire maintainers to work either full-time, part-time, or protected time in open source. I'm all for it. That's great. But funding it itself is not going to fix all of our problems. And I like to use this analogy because most of the times what we're trying to do is we're trying to cover a pothole with duct tape. That's not going to hold. That's not going to fix all of that interlocking challenges that I mentioned before. And again, the reason is because we don't live in a simple system. There is a word, and that I use, again, a lot, that goes back to the post-World War II era, where folks started defining what a socio-technical system is. If you are into ethical AI or ethics in AI, this is a word that is coming more and more, because it pertains to systems, again, involving humans and some sort of tech. I'm not talking about computers, but like any tools, any technology, as well as processes and workflows. And you cannot separate them because it is awfully inappropriate. An easier way to digest this, again, you'll start seeing all the connections. Everything is connected. Everything is interlocking. Everything is intertwined. But this is this is how the Leeds Business School actually defines socio-technical systems. So, following that line of thought or that circle of thought or network of thought, our system is not just an ecosystem. It's a socio-technical system formed by subsystems. We have people, we have infrastructure, we have technology, we have culture, processes, and goals and metrics. We operate in probably a digital or a physical infrastructure, and we share cultural assumptions, we share values, and we share norms. And why is this important? This is important because we have to start building or rebuilding for the upstream. And what I mean when I say building for the upstream is building for sustainability. Building for us to be able to change and face those challenges. I know we like reinventing the wheel. And sometimes we like creating our way, or my project way, or my company way. But here we can take inspiration from the corporate world. The corporate world has a concept called corporate sustainability. It has gone around for many years. I think the Brundtland report was released around 1987, and it was one of the very first reports to define what sustainability is and how we should build for sustainability, meaning build for the future, for longevity without compromising their resources and the decisions of the future populations or the future systems. So the corporate world has figured it out, kind of. And the reason they keep investing in corporate sustainability plans is because the benefits are worth it. Some of these benefits include increased innovation, increased collaboration, better communication, reliable and secure supply chain. And if you think about that, that is what we want. That is what we need in open source. So what can we do there? We can put our open source hat, adopt the open source way, and build on what the corporate world has figured out. As a refresher, 10 seconds, probably 5 seconds. Remember, these are all of the subsystems, all of the interlocking parts. And let's see how we can rethink each of these interlocking systems for us to start building an open source sustainability plan. First of all, community safety. It's not easy to build a diverse, inclusive, safe community. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of intention, a lot of emotional labor, and it is not easy to build an inclusive community or an inclusive, contributor base if people don't feel safe. Behaviors like personally directed criticism, sexualized imagery or comments, bigoting, bike shedding, hateful language, unwelcome attention, all of these actions that have happened not once, not in isolation within the whole collective of open source, undermine the trust required to create a psychologically safe environment for all. And this is what we need. We need to be able to trust each other, to uplift each other. Again, when I'm talking about diversity, it is easy to focus on some visible characteristics. It's easy to count, in some cases, binaries. But I'm not talking about just those binaries or those visibly countable diversity layers. I'm thinking we have to bring all of the full spectrum of human diversity. That includes geography. One of our biggest challenges is that the Global South is still open source consumer more than open source innovators or open source leaders. How can we build these communities that are part of our system but are not growing at the same pace as others? I would say a way to approach that, not the one, probably not the best one, not the optimal, but if you think about it, all of our tutorials, documentation, op-eds, everything is in English. We still have a huge user base that don't speak English. I know there are a lot of narratives that say, well, if you're learning Python, it should be easy to learn English. Right. Now, try to do that when the reason why you're getting into tech, and it's a very, very valid reason, is because you want to give your family a better quality of life. And you're doing that at night when taking care of children or your elder parents, or you are fleeing your country because it's in war. When do we expect these people to have extra time to learn English? Again, we're going to get to non-people diversity in a bit. And then I know some people are going to say, hey, Tania, but like, really, do we need diversity? Yes, we need diversity. And even if not for, if you don't want to believe me, if there are people that are still are a bit dubious about all of the research that has demonstrated time and time again that diverse teams are more innovative, we have more ideas. Do it for the sake of adhering to the open source initiative definition. And that means no discrimination against persons or groups. By not including these folks, are we complying to the values and the definitions of the open source initiative? We're not. Again, now let's rethink leadership. And there is this question, what is a leader in open source? If you start thinking about what is a leader in open source, it starts becoming really complicated pretty soon. And because we don't, like open source is not formed in a traditional structure, let's say like in the corporate world where you have very set roles like CTO, CEO, director, intern, manager, manager of managers. We don't have those roles. We talk so much about mentoring new contributors. We talk a lot about mentoring those folks that we want to bring in our projects. But who talks about mentoring leaders? Who's talking about, okay, let's sit down, identify those critical roles beyond benevolent dictator for life. Let's think about those functions without which my project or my ecosystem might not be able to thrive. Build a mentorship program and allow folks to see a clear path towards leadership, whatever it is. Ultimately, we should start, and then this is it's a complete change in mindset, because we very much interact with corporate world, academia, where these roles are defined. We have to start thinking in terms of verbs and not nouns. We have to start thinking about the functions that each of us facilitates in our projects and our ecosystem. Things like organizes community. Things like triage and welcomes new contributions. And move from the concept of we need to build a leadership pipeline, because we need to build a skill pipeline. Ultimately, all of this goes back to skills. Skills can be learned, but we need to mentor folks. Similar to when you're applying to a job. More than likely, during your interview process or whatever it is, you're gonna ask, what does your career progression look like? It's natural. You don't want to end up in a place where you're gonna be sitting in the same role for the next 10 years, 5 years, with no clear direction. If we have a clear leadership skill pipeline and mentorship programs, these folks that we're inviting can see a clear path to where they're going. They can see a clear path of value exchange for them, the project, and the community. The problem is, and this is a big, big, big problem that I have, we've based a lot of projects base their leadership and the way they do things based on the concept of meritocracy. And I have loads of problems with that. Because in principle, and in theory, conceptually, it is a good idea. Right? Like, you prove your merit, you earn whatever you're earning, you get value for that. But what I've seen in many cases is that meritocracy doesn't work like that. What passes for meritocracy, again, translates to hostility towards new contributors, towards new ideas, and keep reinforcing our echo chambers. So if your concept of meritocracy cannot be defined beyond, I'll know when I see it, and if I'll be able to evaluate if this credits enough merit, then you've not thought it very well as a project, or as an individual, or as a community. And we've seen this time and time again. We've seen folks that come in, have very valuable, very complex skills like community management, project management. I don't know if any of you have ever done project management before. I've done it. And coordinating like that amount of information, people, priorities, making sure that things are handed in time and to is extremely challenging. But because folks are performing these other functions that are not necessarily related to crunching code, they're often dismissed or just not even considered as potential leaders in our projects or communities. And we're missing huge critical skills there. So what do we owe each other in open source? Which are the values around which we should be building to tackle all of these changing mindsets, changing processes, changing metrics? Empowerment, transparency, and kindness. If you look at that, if all of these recommendations are document what you're doing, what your processes are, how someone steps into leadership, what a leader means to you, what skills do you need, you're being transparent. At the same time, if you put on mentorship, not just for newcomers, but folks that might become your leaders or are already in position of leadership, you're empowering them. And you're also treating everyone with kindness, with the same acknowledgement and value proposition, regardless of what skills they're bringing on. We're coming now to a very challenging part, because one of the main questions I get asked, or folks like me that work so much on getting resources, time, structure, process, and longevity to open source is like, okay, now translate that into corporate numbers that I can crunch, statistics that I can crunch, so I know like the value that open source and investing in open source and giving you this talent or money or expertise will bring me. It's extremely hard. This comes again from another extract of Tania Allard. Again, because our ecosystem is just so complex. It's a socio-technical ecosystem with so many moving and interlocking pieces. The impact of digital infrastructure, or open source, is extremely difficult to measure. We have some proxies. We have some data. And Nadia has this hypothesis that if we had better metrics, we were better equipped to describe the economic and societal impact of digital infrastructure in open source. Now, and this is very, very tricky as well, because let's think about it. How are we measuring open source? How are we measuring impact? How are we measuring, again, what is our measuring stick on who's a leader in open source? Right now, and remember, what gets counted counts. That is universal. That's what counts, right? People like hard data. If you're doing whatever role you're doing, you're going to be asked to give some sort of metrics. But think about it. Think about open source. Again, who gets the power to count what gets counted? Right? All of this counting is based on the platforms that we are using to build the software and build community. Examples, GitHub. I spend so much of my time there. GitLab, Discord, Slack, now Orbit. But again, this power gets placed on the people who are doing the counting and make decisions about what data and what methodology to use. What instead, if we shifted that power back to the community, and we were able to fully support, have a full picture of who and how really supports and maintains all of open source. That means, again, thinking about how we make all of the labor visible. And I take inspiration, learnings from so many places. There is this fabulous book that has changed a lot how I think about data from a feminist lens. And exactly that, making all labor visible is the principle 7. And it will help us to build a more equitable community. We need to represent and acknowledge all labor in open source. We need to be able to empower those that are filling those foundational roles and skills. And we need to empower them by giving them acknowledge and making their value explicit. I was recently talking to one of the WordPress core developers. They don't use GitHub, they use something else, and I have forgotten what it is. But I found the principle very interesting. When they're doing a pull request, or the equivalent of a pull request, they are able to annotate whatever it is with props. They have a very special annotation called props. And they use that to acknowledge all sorts of contributions to whatever made that feature or pull request or bug or RFD happen. That includes props to whoever opened the issue, whoever shepherded the discussion, whoever overviewed or coordinated the release. That way, they've gone around it, and they are counting in an imperfect but at least visible manner who's performing what. And they have, their labor is attached to the code, to the commit, because they made that happen. There are some other proxies, like all contributors bots, if you've seen it around in some projects, that allows you to soft acknowledge some of these non-code or non-technical functions. But that doesn't get attached, again, to what is counted ultimately, which are lines of code, added, deleted, PRs, issues, open. Once again, processes. We have processes for everything. And if we don't document these processes, we cannot think about sustainability. Think about documentation of self-service, onboarding, remove the redundancy, the source of truth, documenting, again, these skills and processes, and maintain your project. And again, all of this is based on empowerment, transparency, and kindness. It's the same with infrastructure. So now you're seeing where I'm going. There is, wherever we look, even if it's infrastructure, we want to try and remove monocultures. We want to make whatever we're building more usable, more applicable. We want to ensure access, because again, that's going to bring folks with unique perspectives. That's going to make us more sustainable. Maintenance, though, when you're building a new tool, migrating to a new platform, we have to think, how is this adding or removing to the already massive backlog of my fellow maintainers? Build on empowerment, transparency, and kindness. But how do we even start? It's really, really hard to get started. That's why I wanted to start by asking the question, what does open source mean to you? Identify how many hats you're wearing in the ecosystem. Where do you fit? What is your play? What is your role? Identify your constraints, because that's very important. It's number one premise to know where and within which bounds you're operating, and therefore what you can contribute to or contribute with. Again, empowerment, transparency, and kindness to yourself and to your fellows. Tiffany Harris has perfectly summarized all of the variety of contributions that we can make. As an individual, corporation, organization, ally, champion nonprofit, fiscal sponsor, most of what you're providing will fall in either of these three categories. Talent. As an individual, your skills. As an organization, your organization unique skills or resources. That's why bodies like NumFOCUS that provide legal knowledge and legal advice and mechanisms for projects to receive donations are substantial, because they're reducing that toil and that overhead from the folks that are doing the day-to-day maintenance. Time is precious. If you can spend time organizing events like this, mentoring others, advising others, and treasure. It's okay. I know I said before, probably one-off donations are not the best, but sometimes within our constraints, that's all we have. And that's fine. But again, keep in mind that that's not the only and one solution. These are things that you can shift around, build on, depending, again, if you're an organization, an individual, a champion, or an ally. And more importantly, how can you contribute? Listen to people and meet them where they are. If you're a corporation or trying to convince your organization to make a big donation or play a bigger part in open source, listen to the maintainers. Listen to folks like Leah and Jim that are part of NumFOCUS and know better about what our projects need. Participate meaningfully. Engage with folks. If you're hiring open source maintainers in your company, and your expectation is that they're going to dedicate time to maintain their open source projects, add that as a contractual clause for their protection, for your protection, and that demonstrates some of your commitment to open source. Clarify value exchange. Again, we I know as an organization it's real hard, and justifying budget and time and resources is critical. What are we getting and why? Think about a world where all of the open source projects that you depend on disappeared. What would you lose? Many of us wouldn't be able to serve our customers, to perform our job, to hire people without open source. So if Python were to disappear, that a big chunk of our revenue and profit will be gone. Those are hard numbers that we can operate with. Those are hard numbers that we can take to our leadership in the corporate world and see, this is the potential impact. It's not perfect, but it's something. Again, empowerment, transparency, and kindness. And as I like full circles, as I like, probably you'll have noticed, SciFi, and I take a lot of inspiration from many different and diverse resources. I want to go back to the first question that I asked, and this is now centered to me. What does open source mean to me? For my fellow SciFi aficionados, you'll probably have seen this without knowing the actual word, of an Acumenopolis. It is a very recurring theme in many sci-fi books and films. But basically, it's a future world where every square inch of a planet is covered by a city. For those of you that love Star Wars, Coruscant is an example of this. It's the heart and capital of the galaxy. That's where the Jedi Temple was. If you are more into Isaac Asimov's narrative or of sci-fi, probably you're familiar with Trantor. But this, like, if you think about Corin Scott and Trantor, they're both well-established Acumenopolis. They're built completely. It's covered, right? You can also think about Gotham as some sort of a small version of Acumenopolis if you are more into that type of comics. But one of my favorite books ever is, what is the name? Philip Dick's Do Android Dream of Electric Sheep. That was turned into film. I'm not going to go into how bad it does the film to represent the book, but in the film especially, we see Neo LA, which is not an Acumenopolis per se, but it's building towards it. What's interesting is that you can see big cities like Los Angeles or Neo Los Angeles that have started building like these skyscrapers and everything. You can see how everything has been tangled up and built up based on gentrification, functions that need to be performed. But we still see areas that have not grown or developed as much as, for example, Neo LA, when it cuts to these wastelands. There are still parts that need growing. And this is where I feel we are. We are building bridges, and we're starting to build very well-established, big Acumenopolis. We still have a lot of wastelands or areas that have not caught up yet. And if our dream is building something like this, an Acumenopolis, a really interconnected, sustainable ecosystem, we have to start looking at those areas that are underdeveloped. And it's a lot. And we need all the help, all the hands, all the resources, all the empowerment and kindness and transparency that we can put together. Thank you very much. I am Tania Allard. I hope you enjoyed this very networked, not linear presentation. And I know I'm not naming all of the people that have helped me to build my vision and identifying the challenges in our ecosystem, but I always like to acknowledge them and thank them because they are the people that have treated me with kindness and welcomed me into the community. Thank you, and oh, I killed it. And we'll see you. I will be around for any questions or chats because I went over time and I am sorry.